There are moments in history when an entire world changes in silence. No explosions, no sudden cracks in the sky, no warning that the age you were born into is quietly reaching its final breath. For the people of Constantinople in the spring of 1453, that silence was the first sign that life, as they understood it, was about to disappear. The city had stood for more than 1,000 years, older than kingdoms, older than empires, older than many of the languages spoken across Europe. It was a mosaic of marble, gold, prayer, tradition, exhaustion, and hope. A capital built on memories as much as on stone. And by April 1453, it felt old. Not ruined, never ruined, but tired the way a great mind becomes tired after fighting for too many years. For its last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, the feeling was familiar. He had inherited an empire that was already a shadow of itself. His power stretched only over the city and a few scattered territories. The old roads, the old armies, the old wealth, they had all faded. What remained was the faith of the people, the brilliance of their traditions, and the belief that Constantinople was eternal. Yet eternity has a way of revealing its limits. The Ottoman army under Sultan Mehmed II was already on the move long before the citizens saw the dust clouds on the horizon. Messengers had spoken of it in cold, factual tones. Tens of thousands of soldiers, cannons large enough to be named like living creatures, and a ruler whose ambition stretched beyond the borders of maps. Mehmed was young, only 21, but his will was not. In his mind, the walls of Constantinople were not the final line of an ancient civilization. They were the last obstacle between him and the birth of a new world. Inside the city, preparations began quietly. Gates were checked and reinforced. Archers inspected weapons that had been repaired too many times. Priests walked across neighborhoods, offering blessings to families who could no longer pretend that life was normal. Food stores were counted and recounted with the same result every time. There was barely enough for a long siege. Still, the people lived their days with a strange mixture of fear and routine. Market stalls opened. Boats crossed the Golden Horn. Children played in narrow alleys. And from the high terraces of old houses, residents watched the sky. The same sky their ancestors had seen since the age of Constantine the Great. On the morning of April 5th, the silence broke. A dark line appeared at the edge of the land walls, stretching further than the eye could follow. It was not the sound that reached the city first, but the shape, a massive, shifting mass of soldiers, horses, flags, engineers, and cannons. The largest army Constantinople had ever faced stood just beyond the moat, its tents spreading across the hills like a new city made of cloth and steel. Emperor Constantine rode to the walls that same morning. Accounts describe him as calm, composed, and almost painfully aware of the task placed on his shoulders. He knew what defenders he had: a few thousand Greeks, a few thousand Genoese and Venetians, volunteers, and civilians, perhaps 7,000 in total, against an army that may have numbered between 80 and 100,000. Still, he greeted the men stationed on the ramparts with a steady voice. The world would remember that moment, not because he promised victory, but because he promised to stand with them, not behind them, not above them, but beside them. He would not leave the city. He would not flee. He would defend it as the last emperor of the Romans. Inside the Ottoman camp, Sultan Mehmed observed the city with the focus of someone studying a problem that needed solving. He admired the walls, the Theodosian walls, a marvel of ancient engineering, triple-layered, deep, and formidable, even after 1,000 years. Many armies had tried to break through. None had succeeded. But the young Sultan believed he had something the others did not: technology powerful enough to change the meaning of unbreakable. The giant cannon built by the engineer Orban had already become a legend before it fired its first shot. It was so large it required teams of oxen to move and hours to load. Its purpose was not simply to damage the walls, but to reshape the battlefield. The day it was positioned facing the city, many in Constantinople felt a shift in the air. It was not the fear of war. They had known war for generations. It was the fear of something new, something the walls had never faced before. As the sun set, the city glowed softly with torchlight. Streets became quieter. Churches opened their doors for longer hours. Families gathered together, speaking in low voices about the past, the future, and what might remain of their lives when the siege was over. Some were hopeful, others realistic. A few believed they were witnessing the end of the world. But through all the uncertainty, one truth tied every person together. Constantinople had survived countless storms. It was more than a place. It was an idea, an identity, a light on the edge of two continents. And lights, even when flickering, can be difficult to extinguish. The first thunder of cannon fire arrived like an announcement from a different age. It shook the ground. It echoed across the city. It felt unnatural, deeper than thunder, sharper than an earthquake, louder than anything the walls had endured before. People stepped into the streets, looking toward the land walls. Dust rose from sections of stone. Cracks formed where none had existed the day before. The city understood then that this siege would not be like the others. But it also understood something else. This was the beginning of Constantinople's final test. A test of endurance, identity, and hope. The final chapter in a story that had lasted more than a millennium. The centuries leading to 1453 were shaped by slow erosion, political exhaustion, and the stubborn endurance of a state that by any logical measure should not have survived as long as it did. Constantinople, once the center of the known world, had shrunk into a fragile island of civilization surrounded by rising powers and shifting alliances. Yet even in decline, the city possessed a resilience that defied its circumstances. By the mid-14th century, the Byzantine Empire had already seen its borders reduced to a fragment of their former size. Once stretching across the Mediterranean, the empire was now a thin sliver of land in Thrace, parts of the Peloponnese, and pockets along the Aegean coast. But even this reduced map does not fully capture the reality. What remained of Byzantium was not a cohesive state, but a patchwork of territories loosely connected by tradition, memory, and the fading authority of the crown. Civil wars and a crumbling state. Internal conflict was one of the greatest wounds the empire inflicted upon itself. While neighboring powers expanded with vigor, the Byzantines became trapped in cycles of civil war that drained their resources and divided their people. Between 1321 and 34, a series of brutal internal conflicts erupted between rival claimants to the throne. Armies marched across the empire not to defend its borders, but to fight for control of the shrinking imperial palace. The most devastating struggle was the war between Emperor John V Palaiologos and John VI Kantakouzenos. What might have been a political rivalry became a national catastrophe. Both sides, desperate for military support, made appeals to foreign powers, including the rising Ottomans. This decision would shape the destiny of the empire in ways few understood at the time. The Ottomans, eager to extend their influence into Europe, offered soldiers to support their preferred candidate. Ottoman troops marched across Thrace, fought in Byzantine civil disputes, and observed firsthand the vulnerabilities of the empire. To them, this was more than a political alliance. It was reconnaissance. When the war finally ended, the Byzantines were exhausted. Their treasury was empty. Their fields were ruined. Their remaining fortresses had suffered damage that could no longer be repaired. And the Ottomans, once hired as mercenaries, now remained as neighbors, expanding their foothold deeper into Europe. The Ottoman expansion. The Ottoman Empire in the 14th century was not yet the colossal force it would become, but its momentum was unmistakable. Under the leadership of Orhan and later Murad I, The Ottomans transformed from a frontier principality into a centralized, disciplined, and rapidly growing state. Their army, particularly the emerging corps of Janissaries, represented a new kind of military discipline, something the fragment of Byzantine forces could not counter. While Byzantium relied on mercenaries, often unreliable and expensive, the Ottomans cultivated an elite infantry force trained from childhood to serve the Sultan with unwavering loyalty. The conquest of Gallipoli in 1354, following an earthquake that weakened its walls, marked a decisive moment. For the first time, the Ottomans held permanent territory in Europe. This foothold gave them a strategic platform for expansion into the Balkans. In the decades that followed, the Ottomans pushed north and west with relentless efficiency. Adrianople fell in 1369, becoming the new Ottoman capital in Europe. Serbia was defeated at Kosovo in 1389, ending its status as a major power. Bulgaria became a vassal and later fully absorbed into the empire. The Peloponnese was isolated, its ports vulnerable to Ottoman raids. By the late 14th century, the Byzantine Empire found itself surrounded on all sides. Constantinople became an isolated island within a sea of Ottoman territory. The city still maintained its magnificent walls, its spiritual influence, and its symbolic importance, but these alone could not change the reality on the ground. The siege of 1394 to 1402. Long before the final siege of 1453, Constantinople faced a prolonged blockade under Sultan Bayezid. For nearly 8 years, the Ottomans restricted access to and from the city, starving it economically and politically. The emperor at the time, Manuel II, traveled across Europe seeking aid. He visited Venice, Paris, and even London, pleading for military support. The response he received was polite but insufficient. Europe was deeply fragmented. France and England were locked in the 100 Years' War. The Italian states were competing with one another. The Holy Roman Empire was politically divided. To many in the West, Byzantium seemed too distant, too weakened, and too complicated to save. The blockade eventually ended not because of European intervention, but because of events far to the east. In 1402, the Ottoman army suffered a massive defeat against the forces of Timur, the Central Asian conqueror, whose campaigns reshaped the political landscape of the region. Sultan Bayezid was captured. The Ottoman state fractured into competing factions. And for a brief moment, Byzantium breathed again, a temporary reprieve. The period after the Battle of Ankara gave Constantinople a short-lived period of relative peace. Manuel II used the opportunity to repair parts of the city's defenses, restore diplomatic ties, and stabilize what little remained of the empire. But this recovery was an illusion. The Ottomans, though weakened, were not destroyed. Their internal conflict, known as the Ottoman Interregnum, ended in 1413 with the rise of Mehmed I, who re-established central authority. Under his successors, Murad II and eventually Mehmed II, the empire once again began expanding with renewed strength and purpose. Byzantium, by contrast, had no such revival. Its population continued to shrink, reduced by plague, poverty, and emigration. The once great capital, once home to hundreds of thousands, now held a fraction of that number. Many neighborhoods stood abandoned. Entire districts had returned to farmland. Yet Constantinople's spirit endured. Its churches still echoed with chants. Its markets still functioned. Its scholars still taught. Its walls, the legendary Theodosian walls, still stood firm, a reminder of the city's unbroken resilience. Diplomacy and desperation. As Ottoman power grew, the Byzantine emperors faced a stark choice. Seek help from the West, accept vassal status under the Ottomans, or risk standing alone. At various times, the empire attempted all three. Union with the Catholic Church became one of the most contentious strategies. Many in the West insisted that Byzantium submit to Rome in exchange for military aid. Many in the East saw this as a betrayal of their traditions, a compromise too painful to accept. But the emperors had little room to maneuver. The last emperors of Byzantium, including John VIII and later Constantine XI, traveled or sent envoys across Europe, pleading for support. While they received symbolic gestures, diplomatic courtesies, and promises of future assistance, the military help they hoped for never fully materialized. The empire's financial state was equally dire. To maintain even a minimal defense, the emperors were forced to sell relics, jewels, and artworks. The once great imperial treasury had dwindled to almost nothing. Even the soldiers who guarded the walls often went unpaid. Yet despite these hardships, the people of Constantinople continued to believe in their city. They believed in its history, its mission, and its spiritual legacy. They believed that the capital of the Roman Empire, the New Rome, would endure against all odds. A new sultan with a singular vision. In 1451, a young man ascended the Ottoman throne, Mehmed II. He was only 19 years old, but he possessed a clarity of purpose that few leaders of his time could match. Unlike his predecessors, who had been content to surround and pressure Constantinople, Mehmed had a different ambition. He wanted to conquer it completely, permanently, irrevocably. The fall of Constantinople was not simply a military objective for him. It was a vision, a destiny. He believed that ruling from the ancient capital of the Roman Empire would legitimize his authority and cement his place in history. And he was prepared to reshape the world to make that vision a reality. When Mehmed II returned to the throne in 1451, many rulers across Europe underestimated him. They saw a young sultan, recently ascended, presiding over a prosperous but still recovering empire. They assumed that his age made him inexperienced, perhaps even impulsive. The truth was very different. From childhood, Mehmed had been raised with a singular ambition: to take Constantinople. It was not a dream born from arrogance, but a strategic vision shaped by advisors, teachers, and the legacy of his own dynasty. Ottoman rulers had wanted the city for generations. Mehmed intended to accomplish what his ancestors could not: a mind formed by empires. Mehmed II had received an education that blended Islamic scholarship, classical learning, and the practical realities of ruling a diverse empire. He read histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He studied the military campaigns of Rome. He understood mathematics, engineering, diplomacy, and languages. But above all, he cultivated a fascination with power. Not simply his conquest, but his legacy. Mehmed believed that the rulers remembered by history were those who reshaped the world. And for him, there was no prize more symbolic, more historic, or more transformative than Constantinople. The strategic vision. To Mehmed, taking Constantinople was not merely a matter of prestige. It was a necessity. The city sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It controlled vital trade routes. It served as a symbolic competitor to Ottoman authority. As long as Constantinople remained independent, the Ottomans would never truly dominate the region. The Sultan studied the weaknesses of the Byzantine Empire with scientific attention. He understood its internal divisions, its shrinking population, its fragile finances, and its weakened fortifications. He knew the walls were legendary, but he also knew they had not been tested by modern cannon fire on a large scale. Where others saw a stubborn, resilient city, Mehmed saw a ripe opportunity: securing his borders. Before any siege could begin, Mehmed needed to ensure that his flank was secure. Revolts, disputes, or foreign interference could disrupt a prolonged campaign, so he began his preparations immediately. He made peace with Hungary to avoid conflict during the coming siege. He reasserted Ottoman authority over rebellious vassals in the Balkans. He secured Anatolia, eliminating rival powers who might challenge him. He restructured his administration to centralize authority and ensure loyalty. In doing so, he created the conditions for an uninterrupted, focused assault on Constantinople. Diplomacy as a weapon. Mehmed used diplomacy as strategically as he used armies. Publicly, he assured the Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI, that peace would continue. Privately, he prepared for war. He sent envoys to Venice, Genoa, and other Italian states, not to ask for support, but to determine whether they would intervene. The responses were cautious and slow. Venice was preoccupied with commercial matters. Genoa was divided by internal politics. The papacy debated how much effort it should invest in defending a city many in the West viewed as distant and reluctant to unify with Rome. Mehmed recognized that Europe's hesitation was his greatest advantage. The construction of Rumeli Hazari. The clearest sign of Mehmed's intentions was the construction of Rumeli Hazari, a massive fortress built on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly opposite the older fortress Anadolu Hazari on the Asian side. Together, these two strongholds allowed the Ottomans to control all traffic through the strait. Work began in early 1452, and Mehmed demanded unprecedented speed. Thousands of workers labored day and night. Entire forests were cut down for timber. Stone was hauled from miles away. The construction disturbed the daily life of the region, but the Sultan did not care. He visited the site frequently, inspecting the walls, questioning engineers, and pushing for faster progress. In just 4 months, the fortress was completed, a feat that impressed even the Sultan's enemies. Its walls rose above the water, thick and imposing. Its towers were equipped with powerful cannons, capable of sinking any ship that attempted to pass without Ottoman permission. This was more than a military project. It was a declaration of intent, and it sent a chilling message to Constantinople. Your isolation is complete. Tension within the city. Inside Constantinople, the mood oscillated between fear and resignation. Emperor Constantine XI was acutely aware that the empire could not withstand an Ottoman siege alone. He sought support from the West, writing letters, sending envoys, and appealing to old alliances. But division within the city weakened these efforts. The proposed union with the Catholic Church split the population. Some believed it was a necessary sacrifice. Others saw it as a betrayal. Priests, monks, and scholars debated the issue passionately, sometimes bitterly, filling the city with arguments when unity was needed most. Yet Constantine XI persisted. He was not a ruler of luxury or arrogance. He was a soldier, a realist, a man who understood the gravity of the moment. He strengthened the walls, ensured supplies were stocked, and prepared his people for the inevitable siege. But the numbers were not on his side. Constantinople had fewer than 8,000 soldiers who could assist in its defense. Many were locals, some were foreign volunteers. The city still had courage, but courage alone was not enough. The Ottoman war machine awakens. While Constantinople scrambled for allies, Mehmed mobilized his empire with calm precision. He summoned troops from across Anatolia and the Balkans, cavalry, infantry, engineers, and artillery crews. The Janissaries, the elite core of his army, were placed at the center of his plans. But Mehmed's greatest weapon was yet to come. The Great Bombard. To break the Theodosian walls, Mehmed required artillery unlike anything previously used in the region. For this, he enlisted the help of Orban, a Hungarian engineer and master founder of cannons. Orban had once offered his services to the Byzantines, but their treasury was too empty to fund his designs. Mehmed, in contrast, gave him everything he needed: raw materials, manpower, and time. The result was extraordinary. Orban constructed several massive cannons capable of launching stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms. The largest of these, the Great Bombard, could fire a projectile over a mile. Its barrel was so large that a man could climb inside it. Transporting this weapon was a challenge in itself. Hundreds of oxen and thousands of men escorted it across the empire. The road shook beneath its weight. Bridges were reinforced. Fields were cleared to make room for its passage. Every village, town, and city along the route understood the same thing. A new era of warfare had begun. Preparations for the final siege. As winter ended and 1453 approached, Mehmed completed his preparations. His fleet was strengthened. His supply lines were secured. His armies were positioned around Thrace. He had constructed a navy, ensured food and gunpowder were stockpiled, and finalized siege plans with meticulous care. The Sultan no longer concealed his intentions. He sent his last diplomatic message to Emperor Constantine XI, a demand that he surrender the city peacefully. Constantine refused, not out of arrogance, but out of dignity. He declared that the city belonged to its people, and it was not his to surrender. This answer sealed the fate of Constantinople, the calm before the storm. In the weeks before the siege began, the city prepared in silence. Churches filled with worshippers. Citizens repaired walls. Foreign volunteers arrived. The emperor inspected fortifications daily, speaking with soldiers, monks, and ordinary citizens. Constantinople was small. It was weakened, but it was united. On the Ottoman side, the mood was very different. Mehmed's camps buzzed with activity. Engineers constructed siege towers, dug trenches, and positioned artillery. The Sultan addressed his commanders, reminding them of the historical significance of the coming battle. For Mehmed, this was destiny. For the Byzantines, it was survival. And as spring returned to the region, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic sieges in human history. The morning of April 6, 1453, arrived quietly. The air was still, the sea calm, and the fields outside Constantinople covered in a soft spring haze. But as the sun lifted over the horizon, the silence broke. Ottoman horns echoed across the plains of Thrace. Drums thundered. The ground trembled beneath thousands of marching feet. The siege of Constantinople had begun. The Ottoman encirclement. Mehmed II positioned his forces with deliberate precision. Nearly 80,000 to 100,000 soldiers formed a vast ring around the city, stretching from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara. The Janissaries, his elite infantry, took the central position facing the strongest section of the walls. Auxiliary troops, irregular forces, and provincial levies filled the outer ranks. Siege engineers directed teams building firing platforms, digging trenches, and assembling artillery positions. The great bombard and dozens of smaller cannons were dragged into place using ropes, pulleys, and the strength of hundreds of men. Each cannon was oriented toward the Theodosian walls, the legendary defensive line that had protected the city for 1,000 years. For the defenders watching from the parapets, the scene below was overwhelming. A sea of tents, banners, siege engines, and shimmering armor. At the center, near his crimson pavilion, stood the young Sultan himself, calm, composed, and fully aware of the moment's gravity. Inside the city, resolve and fear. In Constantinople, tension filled the air. The city still held dignity, but it felt the weight of its vulnerability. Emperor Constantine XI had only 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers, including a few hundred Genoese and Venetian volunteers. The rest were local militia, priests, sailors, and men with no formal training. Yet despite their numbers, they fought with determination. Volunteers patrolled the walls. Artisans repaired broken masonry. Women carried stones and water to reinforce defensive positions. Priests walked along the battlements, offering blessings and comfort. The people of Constantinople had no illusions. They knew the odds. But they were united by a deep sense of identity. This city was their home, their history, their last refuge. Constantine XI himself moved constantly between the walls and the city. encouraging defenders, inspecting positions, and coordinating his small but committed army. His leadership was steady, calm, and unwavering. The first cannon fire. When the Ottoman artillery finally opened fire, the sound shook the entire region. The great bombard unleashed its first shot with a roar that echoed across the water. The projectile, a stone ball weighing hundreds of kilograms, slammed into the outer walls, sending dust and debris into the air. People across the city stopped in fear as the vibrations ran through the ground. Artillery fire continued throughout the day, sometimes stopping only to cool the overheated cannons. Each shot carved more fractures into the walls. The Byzantines scrambled to repair the damage as quickly as it appeared. This pattern became daily life. Before dawn, artillery fire. Afternoon, infantry probes. Night, frantic repairs. Dawn again, renewed bombardment. Constantinople lived in a cycle of destruction and resistance. The naval standoff. While the cannons hammered the land walls, Mehmed also focused on the sea. His fleet of around 100 ships, though not as skilled as the Venetian navy, was large and well organized. The goal was simple: blockade the harbor and cut off all hope of resupply. But the Byzantines had one final defensive advantage: the chain of the Golden Horn, a massive iron chain, supported by floating logs and anchored to fortified towers, blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn. No ship could enter or exit without permission. Mehmed's navy attempted to break it by force, but failed. Even his largest galleys could not lift or snap the chain. This single barrier saved the city from immediate naval collapse. A glimmer of hope. The Christian fleet arrives. On April 20th, the defenders witnessed something extraordinary. 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese supply vessels, and 1 Byzantine transport approached the Bosphorus carrying grain, weapons, and soldiers. They attempted to run the blockade, sailing toward the Golden Horn. Mehmed immediately ordered his fleet to intercept them. What followed was a chaotic naval battle. Ottoman ships surrounded the convoy, ramming and boarding, but the larger, heavier Genoese vessels held firm. Their sailors were experienced. Their captains were fearless. Their hulls towered above the Ottoman galleys. Thousands of people watched from both sides, soldiers from the walls, citizens from rooftops, and the Sultan himself from the shore. The sea churned with smoke and broken wood. After hours of fighting, the Christian ships broke through and entered the Golden Horn to the sound of church bells and cheers from the city. It was a moment of hope, a sign that Constantinople had not been entirely abandoned. Mehmed, however, felt humiliated. His fleet had failed in front of the entire army. The Sultan was furious. And from that fury came one of the most daring and imaginative moves in siege history: the fleet over the mountains. Mehmed issued an unprecedented order. He would move his ships overland. Using wooden rollers, lubricated beams, and enormous manpower, Ottoman engineers transported over 70 ships across the hills of Galata, dragging them from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn. The operation took place over a single night in almost total silence. By morning, the Byzantines could not believe their eyes. Ottoman ships, battle-ready and fully armed, now floated inside the Golden Horn, behind a chain meant to protect the harbor. The defenders were shocked. Some thought it was a miracle. Others believed it was a cruel sign of their fate. This maneuver changed everything. The city was no longer protected from a naval assault. The rear walls, previously considered safe, were now vulnerable. Constantine XI was forced to divide his already small forces even further. Constant repairs and desperate counterattacks. Throughout late April and early May, the siege intensified. Artillery fire increased. Large sections of the outer walls collapsed under prolonged bombardment. The Byzantines built makeshift defenses behind the rubble, wooden palisades, earthworks, and hastily mortared stones. The defenders launched night raids to destroy Ottoman siege engines. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they were driven back with heavy losses. One of the most critical points of the defense was the Mesoteichion, near the gate of St. Romanus, the central section of the Theodosian walls. This area suffered the heaviest artillery hits, and Mehmed focused his strongest attacks there. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander hired to support the defense, proved vital. His leadership, discipline, and engineering knowledge helped stabilize the crumbling walls. His presence raised morale. Many Byzantines believed the city still had a chance as long as Giustiniani held the line. Psychological warfare. Mehmed combined brute force with psychological pressure. He sent envoys offering generous terms if the city surrendered. He promised the citizens safety, property, and freedom. He told Constantine XI that resistance was pointless. The emperor refused every offer. He replied that he could not surrender a city entrusted to him by God and by history. This answer only strengthened the resolve of the defenders, but it also convinced Mehmed that negotiation was finished. Now, only force would decide the fate of Constantinople, the tunnels beneath the earth. As the siege dragged on, Ottoman miners began digging underground tunnels intended to reach beneath the walls. They planned to collapse sections of the fortifications from below using explosives or structural sabotage. But the Byzantines countered with their own miners. They listened through the earth, identified tunnels by the vibrations, and launched underground counterattacks. Several tunnel collapses turned into fierce combat in complete darkness. Soldiers fought with knives, axes, and bare hands. In the cramped, dust-filled tunnels, every breath was a struggle and every strike deadly. These subterranean battles were small in scale, but symbolic of the defenders' determination. They refused to yield even the soil beneath their feet. The siege reaches its climax. By late May, the city was exhausted. Parts of the walls were reduced to rubble. Food supplies were running low. Soldiers barely slept. Repairs could no longer keep pace with artillery damage. The population prayed constantly. Each day felt heavier than the one before it. Mehmed understood that the city was nearing collapse. He prepared for a final, decisive assault, one massive attack that would overwhelm the defenses once and for all. But before launching it, he offered one last chance for surrender. Constantine XI declined. With that answer, the final chapter of the 1,100-year Byzantine Empire began. The last week of May 1453 carried a feeling that everyone in Constantinople could sense, but no one dared to speak aloud. A heaviness settled over the city, a weight shaped by exhaustion, hunger, and the knowledge that something irreversible was coming. The siege had lasted nearly 2 months. The walls were failing. The people were exhausted, and the Ottoman army showed no sign of slowing down the crumbling defenses. Every morning began the same way, with the thunder of artillery. By now, the Ottomans had refined their firing positions. Their cannons hit the same weakened sections of wall repeatedly, tearing open deeper and wider fractures. At the Mesoteichion, near the gate of St. Romanus, the once mighty Theodosian walls were almost unrecognizable. Large holes gaped open. Towers stood cracked. Stone blocks lay scattered across the field like broken teeth. The defenders patched what they could each night, but the repairs were temporary. Every sunrise erased their progress. Constantine XI walked the battlements daily, speaking softly with guards, praising their resilience, encouraging those who looked drained. His presence kept morale alive. Even the exhausted soldiers straightened their backs when the emperor approached. But he could see the truth in every face. The city could not hold forever. The Ottoman camp. Preparations for the end. Outside the walls, Mehmed II prepared for the final strike. The Sultan had turned the siege into a machine. Well-regulated, relentless, efficient. Supplies flowed constantly. Morale was high. His troops were numerous and disciplined. And every day brought new ladders, new siege tools, and heavier artillery fire. His commanders urged him to wait for more famine, more exhaustion, more collapse inside the city. But Mehmed had no interest in delay. He wanted Constantinople now. By late May, scouts, engineers, and officers moved constantly across the Ottoman lines, measuring distances, inspecting breaches, choosing assault routes. The Sultan ordered fires lit across the plains at night, so work could continue around the clock. The city's fall was no longer a question of if, but when. The priests and the people. Inside Constantinople, churches overflowed. People from every neighborhood, Greek, Latin, Armenian, even refugees from the countryside, gathered beneath vaulted ceilings to pray for deliverance. Priests moved through the crowds, offering blessings, comfort, and the reassurance that suffering brought spiritual reward. Chants echoed through the streets long after midnight. There was fear, but also unity. Centuries of tensions between Orthodox and Catholic citizens seemed to fade. Under the shadow of destruction, they found common ground in their desperation to protect their home. Nightly processions wound through the streets, candles flickering in the wind as worshippers carried icons, relics, and crosses. They asked for a miracle, any miracle. Even though many feared none would come, Giustiniani's final stand. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander leading the defense of the land walls, was still the most essential figure on the ramparts. He coordinated repairs, moved reinforcements, inspected breaches, and personally fought in several close-quarter skirmishes. But even he was weakening. Weeks of battle had left him exhausted. His armor was battered, his cloak torn, his left arm injured. Yet he refused to rest. Whenever someone asked if the city could still be saved, his answer was always the same. While the walls stand, so will we. But the walls no longer stood, not in the way they once had. The Great Breach. On May 25th, the Ottomans achieved a breakthrough that could not be ignored. A massive artillery strike hit the central section of the wall with staggering force. The entire structure shook, a tower collapsed, and a large breach, wide enough for dozens of soldiers to pass through, opened in the outer wall. Dust filled the air like a cloud. The defenders rushed forward, coughing, stumbling, blindly trying to block the opening. They built makeshift barricades from timber, earth, and shattered stone. But everyone knew this was only a temporary fix. The inner wall, the final barrier, now stood exposed. Mehmed's final demand. Sensing the end was near, Mehmed sent one final message to Constantine XI. He offered honorable terms. Surrender the city, and the emperor, his officials, and all citizens would be spared. They would be allowed to leave with their possessions. Churches would remain intact. Families would stay together. It was the most generous offer he had ever made. Constantine XI refused. He said he would rather die defending his city than live knowing he had surrendered its people to foreign rule. When Mehmed heard this, he no longer held back. The preparations ended. The orders were given. The final assault would take place before dawn on May 29th. The last night, the night of May 28th, was unlike any other in the city's long history. The Ottoman camp glowed with thousands of torches. Soldiers prayed, sharpened weapons, and prepared themselves mentally for the attack. The sound of chanting rolled across the plains like the hum of a storm. Inside Constantinople, the mood was somber, reflective, sacred. Churches remained open late into the night. People confessed sins, embraced family members, and asked for forgiveness. Old enemies reconciled. Strangers comforted one another. There was a sense that the city had become one heartbeat, unified by sorrow and resolve. Constantine XI attended the final liturgy in the Hagia Sophia. The massive dome echoed with hymns sung by hundreds of voices. For a moment, the old power of the empire, its faith, its culture, its spirit, felt alive again. After the service, The emperor walked through his palace halls one last time. His eyes lingered on mosaics, statues, and familiar rooms. Then he returned to the walls, where he intended to fight and die beside his soldiers. The calm before the storm. In the final hours before the assault, the city fell strangely quiet. No cannons fired. No infantry probed the walls. No horns sounded. A profound, eerie silence stretched across Constantinople. A silence weighted with fear and finality. The defenders took their positions, clutching weapons, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the breaches. They heard movements in the distance. Armor rustling, horses shifting, whispers carried on the wind. But they could not see the army waiting just beyond the ruins. The moonlit ruins of the outer wall cast long shadows. Torches flickered along the battlements. Somewhere in the distance, a child cried. A dog barked. Then silence again. Every man on the walls sensed the same truth. When the sun rose, their world would end. The attack begins. Just after midnight, the first Ottoman horns shattered the silence. Drums roared across the plains. Shouts filled the night. Torches glowed like rivers of fire as thousands of soldiers surged forward. The final assault on Constantinople had begun. The defenders braced themselves. Giustiniani commanded the center. Constantine XI stood nearby, sword drawn. The Genoese and Greeks fought side by side, united by desperation. The first wave slammed into the breaches, irregular troops pushing forward with ladders and shields. Many fell quickly under arrows and stones, but more replaced them. Ottoman drums grew louder, more waves followed. The night sky lit with fire and smoke. The city shook under the weight of its final battle. The final days of Constantinople were defined by a rhythm of exhaustion, a slow collapse of strength, morale, and certainty. Inside the walls, the population lived in a permanent twilight between hope and despair. Outside the walls, the Ottomans prepared for the end, methodical, confident, and relentless. By the final week of May, the city felt hollow. The streets were quieter than usual. People rarely spoke above a whisper. Every sound, the clatter of a distant hammer, the echo of boots on stone, the low hum of prayer seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, stretching into the silence. The emperor and his defenders, though fractured and weary, still clung to a strange, unwavering conviction that the city of Constantine, the city of emperors, might survive the impossible. But the truth was already written. The fall had begun long before the final assault. It had begun in the cracks along the walls, the dwindling supplies, the empty granaries, and the fatigue carved into every face. And now, with the largest bombardment the world had ever seen still hammering the city, the final breach approached. The great bombards tear the city open. For nearly 50 days, the Ottoman cannons had not stopped. The ground itself trembled from their impact. People inside the city could not remember the last moment of silence. Some cannons were massive, monstrous bronze weapons weighing tons. One of them, built by the Hungarian engineer Urban, could fire a marble ball weighing more than half a ton. The blast shook buildings across the city. Windows shattered. Timbers groaned. Children cried in terror. But the defenders repaired the walls almost as quickly as they fell. Night after night, teams of exhausted men dragged stones, mortar, and wooden beams to reinforce the breaches. They worked by torchlight. They worked while arrows rained down. They worked while the ground quaked beneath artillery fire. Yet every repair was temporary. The earthworks collapsed again and again. The cracks grew larger. The foundation weakened. The walls were no longer the immovable fortress they once had been. They were becoming fragile. And Mehmed II knew it. The Ottomans prepared for the final assault. On May 27th, the Sultan ordered a day of rest for his troops. No bombardment, no skirmishes, only silence and preparation. Inside the Ottoman camp, soldiers sharpened weapons, repaired armor, and cleaned firearms. The Janissaries performed their silent drills, thousands of men moving with perfect discipline. Behind them, engineers reviewed the siege ladders, the hooks, and the battering rams. The atmosphere was strangely calm. It was the calm of inevitability. Mend walked among his men, speaking not as a distant ruler, but as a commander who would share in the coming storm. His confidence was absolute. He believed destiny was on his side. He believed Constantinople was already his. The night before the final assault, he called his officers and generals together. The meeting was brief. The message was simple. Tomorrow, the city will fall. Inside the walls, fear and faith intertwine. By contrast, inside Constantinople, the final night was filled with movement. Church bells rang softly. People walked through the streets carrying candles, filling the city with small islands of flickering light. They prayed. They wept. They embraced. They confessed to one another. They forgave old grievances. For the first time in centuries, the city's Greeks and Latins came together, praying side by side in Hagia Sophia. Orthodox and Catholic differences no longer mattered, not when survival itself was collapsing. The Emperor, Constantine XI, watched over the final preparations. He rode through the streets, speaking to soldiers individually. He thanked them by name. He encouraged them with words that felt impossibly calm. He knew they would not survive. He knew he himself would not survive. Yet he remained steady. The night before the end, on May 28, the city entered an unnatural state of quiet. The bombardments had stopped. For the first time in almost 2 months, no cannonballs fell on the walls. This silence was terrifying. Defenders stood at their posts, gripping weapons tightly. They could hear their own breathing. They could hear the wind moving across the broken battlements. They could hear distant chants of the Ottoman army on the far side of the land walls. The city was holding its breath. As night fell, the emperor convened his final council. The leaders of the defense, Genoese officers, Byzantine nobles, common captains, priests, gathered one last time. There were no debates, no arguments, only acceptance. One chronicler wrote, "We knew we stood at the edge of the living world. The torches light the horizon." In the hours before dawn on May 29th, the horizon suddenly ignited. Tens of thousands of Ottoman torches lit up the night like a second sunrise. The land outside the walls shimmered with fire lines of soldiers, siege towers, artillery crews, and endless ranks of infantry stretching as far as the eye could see. The chanting began, deep, rhythmic, relentless. It rolled across the plains like thunder. The city heard it. The defenders felt it in their bones. The assault was moments away. The first wave hits the walls. Before sunrise, the Ottoman irregulars surged forward, the Bashi Bazouks, a chaotic force of volunteers and raiders. They were not meant to break the walls. They were meant to exhaust the defenders. They rushed toward the breaches, shouting wildly, firing arrows as they ran. Most had no armor. Some carried nothing more than axes or knives. The defenders pushed them back easily, but at a cost. Arrows struck men along the battlements. Stones thrown by slings cracked helmets. Musket fire echoed up the ladders. Exhaustion grew. By the time the first wave retreated, the defenders were already drained. But this was only the beginning. The second wave, the Anatolian infantry. The next wave was more disciplined. The Anatolian troops advanced in tight formations, carrying shields, hooks, and ladders. They attacked the same weakened sections of the wall, especially near the St. Romanus Gate. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, relentless. The defenders pushed them back too, but each push cost more lives. Muscles burned. Breathing grew ragged. Arms grew heavy. And the sun had not yet fully risen. The moment everything changed. When the second wave retreated, a brief silence hung over the battlefield. Then the drums changed rhythm. A deeper, steadier beat. The Janissaries were stepping forward. The elite. The disciplined. The unstoppable. When they advanced, they did so in silence. No shouting. No wild charges. Only precision. This was the final wave. This was the moment the entire siege had been building toward. Constantine and his remaining generals saw the Janissaries approach and knew the walls would not hold much longer. The breach opens. At the Kirka Porta, a small, unguarded postern gate near the northern section of the walls, something went terribly wrong. The gate had been left open, perhaps by accident, perhaps by exhaustion, perhaps during a repair effort. A handful of Ottoman soldiers noticed it. They entered quietly. They climbed the inner wall. They planted a small flag on the battlements. It was a tiny foothold, barely significant. But from a distance, other Ottoman troops saw the rising flag and believed the walls had been taken. They surged toward the breach, and thousands more followed. Inside the city, panic spread. Defenders rushed to counterattack, but the pressure was overwhelming. Janissaries poured through the gaps. More forces climbed the walls. The Byzantine lines began to fracture. And then, legend says, Constantine XI threw himself into the fight, not as an emperor, but as a soldier. It was the final stand, the last stand of the Roman Empire. When the Janissaries surged through the breaches, the final shape of the battle was no longer uncertain. The defenders were overwhelmed. The walls, cracked and hollowed by weeks of bombardment, crumbled under the pressure of thousands of fresh troops. Inside the city, sounds of the assault began to echo through every street. Shattering gates, clashing steel, distant screams, the steady rhythm of war drums. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the city of Constantinople was no longer sealed against invasion. It was open, and the last phase of the fall began. The collapse of the defenses. As the Janissaries advanced, defenders retreated toward the inner city. Some moved in organized groups, others scattered, disoriented and exhausted. The final hours were defined by chaos. Stones everywhere, dust hanging in the air, torches smoking in the wind, and the low rumble of tens of thousands of soldiers entering the broken walls. The emperor had fought at the Lycus Valley, where the breach was widest. Here, the Janissaries pressed hardest, pushing deeper into the defenses. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, who had led so much of the city's resistance, fell wounded during the fighting. He was evacuated by his men, unable to continue. His departure sent a wave of fear through the defenders. He had been their shield, their anchor. Without him, their morale collapsed. And once morale broke, the defenses followed. Men began to pull back faster, moving deeper into the city, leaving the walls to the advancing Ottoman forces. Constantine's final stand. History does not preserve every detail of what happened to Emperor Constantine XI in the final moments. But the accounts that do exist agree on one thing. He refused to flee. When he realized the walls were lost, he is said to have spoken a final, quiet sentence to those near him. "The city is fallen. I will not survive it." He removed his imperial insignia, choosing to die as a common soldier. Then he rode into the thick of the fighting, disappearing into the chaos. Some witnesses claimed they saw him battling fiercely near the St. Romanus Gate. Others said they found a body later, richly armored, surrounded by Ottomans. But no one ever confirmed his identity. His final resting place is unknown. The last Roman emperor vanished in the ruins of his own city. The streets become battlefields. As the walls collapsed, fighting spilled into the city itself. By now, the sun had risen fully, revealing smoke drifting upward from burning houses, shattered rooftops, and broken stone. The Ottoman advance was rapid and coordinated. Units split into multiple directions, some toward the imperial palace, others toward important gates. and many toward the heart of the city, Hagia Sophia. For the civilians, there was no escape. Old men, women, clerics, and children fled into side streets and alleys, hoping for shelter. Some hid in their homes, barricading doors with furniture. Others ran toward churches, believing holy ground might protect them. But nowhere was safe. The Ottomans had clear orders. The city was to be taken, and its population subdued. The fall was total, the rush toward Hagia Sophia. Across the city, the great church of Hagia Sophia became the final refuge. People flooded toward it, thousands upon thousands filling the courtyard, the steps, the narthex. Inside, the atmosphere was surreal. Candles flickered. The massive dome loomed overhead like a dark sky. Priests chanted hymns. Families held each other tightly. Some prayed silently, others aloud. Many simply stared at the great doors, waiting for what would come. The church had been the spiritual heart of the empire for nearly a millennium. In times of crisis, people believed angels would descend to protect it. They believed the walls would not fall. They believed Constantinople was eternal. But belief could not stop an army of 80,000. Outside, the thunder of boots approached. Moments later, the doors of Hagia Sophia were forced open. Ottoman soldiers entered, weapons drawn. The crowd fell silent. Centuries of worship, tradition, and history came to an end in an instant. The great church, once a symbol of Christian Rome, was now a symbol of conquest. The palace falls and the city breaks. At the Blasciani Palace, the emperor's residence, the last defenders attempted a final resistance. But with the city collapsing from all sides, the palace could not be held. Ottoman soldiers quickly broke through the gates, overrunning the courtyards and hallways. By midday, the banners of the Ottomans flew over the walls. The city was theirs. The sounds of battle slowly faded. In their place came new sounds. Shouting, cries, weeping, and the shifting rumble of an army moving deeper into its prize. For the first time since the founding of the city in 330 AD, Constantinople was no longer Roma. The empire that had survived plagues, invasions, crusades, and centuries of decline had finally reached its end. After more than 1,000 years, the last chapter had been written. But the story of the city was not finished. A new chapter was about to begin. Mehmed II enters the city. The Sultan did not rush into the ruins. He waited until the fighting had subsided, then entered the city with a controlled, measured procession. He rode past broken walls, abandoned weapons, and streets filled with debris. He saw the destruction, but also the potential. To him, Constantinople was not only a victory, it was a future. When he reached Hagia Sophia, he dismounted. He entered the church, now filled with Ottoman guards. The crowd inside fell silent as he looked up at the massive dome. He admired its grandeur, its scale, its impossible architecture. Then he ordered the building to be converted into a mosque, not destroyed, not abandoned, transformed. This was symbolic. This was intentional. Constantinople would not remain a ruined city. It would rise again, but under his rule, his culture, his vision. The aftermath of the fall. By the evening of May 29th, the streets grew quieter. Fires burned in several districts, filling the air with smoke. The surviving population was shell-shocked, wandering as if in a nightmare. For many, the fall felt unreal, as if they had woken into a world where the impossible had happened. The Roman Empire, the empire of Constantine, Justinian, Heraclius, and Theodora, was gone. Mehmed moved quickly to stabilize the city. He issued proclamations to stop unnecessary destruction. He ordered key populations relocated to repopulate the capital. He began planning new buildings, markets, schools, and walls. The city would live, but it would no longer be a Roman city. It would no longer be Constantinople. It would become Istanbul, When the sun rose over the shattered city on May 30th, 1453, Constantinople was no longer the ancient capital of a dying empire. It was the heart of something entirely new. Smoke drifted above ruined houses. Streets were silent, except for the footsteps of Ottoman guards. The wounds of the siege were everywhere: broken gates, collapsed towers, abandoned carts, and shattered icons lying in dust. But among this destruction, a different kind of movement began. Scribes, architects, officials, engineers. The machinery of a new empire was arriving. This was not the end of a city. It was its transformation. Mehmed II's vision for a new capital. Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, stepped into the city with a clarity of purpose that stunned even his closest advisors. He did not see ruins. He saw a canvas. His goal was not merely conquest. It was rebirth. And so, as the fires cooled, he issued the orders that would define the next 500 years of history. Rebuild the markets. Repair the walls. Repopulate the city. Turn Constantinople into the greatest capital the world had ever seen. He brought in families from across the empire. Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Jews, Slavs, Arabs, Persians. He wanted diversity. He wanted culture. He wanted a city that reflected the full scale of his empire. Within months, Constantinople, now Istanbul, began to breathe again. Hagia Sophia becomes a symbol of change. Mehmed's most symbolic decision was claiming Hagia Sophia. The great church had stood for nearly 1,000 years, unmatched in glory. Its dome had inspired legends. Its mosaics had defined centuries of Christian art. Now, under Mehmed, it became something new. A mosque. Minarets were constructed. A mihrab was added. Islamic calligraphy joined ancient Byzantine marble. But the building was not destroyed. It was preserved. Mehmed understood something profound. Architecture is memory. To reshape a building is to reshape history itself. By converting Hagia Sophia, he was not erasing the past. He was absorbing the prestige, the legacy, and the symbolism of the Roman world into his own empire. Istanbul became a bridge between civilizations. The city heals, slowly. Over the next years, the city transformed at an astonishing pace. The Grand Bazaar began to rise, destined to become one of the largest markets on earth. Schools opened. Baths reopened. Workshops filled with craftsmen rebuilding what had been lost. The call to prayer echoed through streets where church bells had rung for centuries. New neighborhoods grew around old Byzantine structures. The city was no longer Roman, but it was not entirely Ottoman either. It became something layered, hybrid, deeply complex. A place shaped by every empire that had touched it. And this diversity would become its greatest strength. Europe reacts. Shock turns to fear. To the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the fall of Constantinople hit like an earthquake. Chroniclers wrote that May refused to believe the news. Some cried in public squares. Some interpreted it as a divine punishment. Others as a warning. The political consequences were immediate and far-reaching. 1. Calls for a new crusade grew louder. But Europe was divided, weakened by internal rivalries. 2. Trade routes shifted overnight. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the connection between East and West. 3. Scholars fled westward, bringing ancient Greek manuscripts to Italy, manuscripts that would accelerate the Renaissance. The fall of the city, tragic as it was for Byzantium, became a spark for the Western world. Knowledge spread. Art flourished. A new intellectual movement erupted. In this paradox, history revealed its strange symmetry. One empire's collapse became another civilization's rebirth. The Ottoman Golden Age begins. For the Ottoman Empire, the capture of Constantinople was more than a military victory. It was a unifying moment. After 1453, Mehmed II reorganized the empire with ruthless precision and remarkable vision. He stabilized the borders, strengthened the navy, encouraged trade across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, built new fortifications and palaces, modernized administration and law. Under his leadership, Istanbul became the cultural and economic center of a vast empire stretching across 3 continents. Artists traveled from Persia, engineers arrived from Italy, scientists came from the Muslim world. Merchants from every direction filled the growing markets. The city flourished in a way it had not for centuries. The fall had been catastrophic. The rebirth was extraordinary. The end of an empire, the beginning of a legend. The Byzantine Empire died in 1453, but its legacy did not vanish. It lived on in its architecture, in its traditions, and the ideas it passed to Europe and the Middle East. It lived on in Orthodox Christianity, in Slavic cultures, in art and scripture. It lived on in Istanbul, a city shaped by Rome, transformed by Byzantium, and reborn under the Ottomans. The fall of Constantinople was not simply a battle. It was one of the great turning points of human history. It marked the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the early modern era. A door closed, a new world opened, and the echoes of that morning in 1453 still ripple through our present. A slow, cinematic ending. As the documentary closes, imagine the final shots. The sun setting over the Bosphorus. The silhouette of Hagia Sophia's dome against a purple sky. Ancient walls casting long shadows over the water. The Golden Horn glowing with reflections of lanterns. Footsteps echoing through narrow stone streets. The layers of history, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman merging into one living city. A city that was conquered. A city that was reborn. A city that still stands. Constantinople fell, but its story never ended.